You can say all you want in the classroom, you can read the books, but until you go and visit the actual scenes of the battles and the actual graveyards, then and only then does that actually affect you, when you see all the graves, the thousands and thousands of bodies that are still out there. And this really makes an impression on these children.
I went out for more or less a history trip. I thought it was a history trip, but it was an emotional roller coaster. All the leaders said that, and they said that although you may not cry very easily, it's going to be on the brink of crying every time you go and see the different grave sites and stuff. And it was amazing, standing in the middle of Tynecott and all surrounded with all these graves, and you're thinking, why?
I think when you're standing in Tynecott and you seen the number of graves, and you're just thinking, what was the point? Was there really any need? And what, there was no good came out of it or nothing? And there was no need for that many people to die.
When they went to look at the graveyards and they saw the rows upon rows upon rows of gravestones, I think the enormity of what had happened out there actually hit them.
It was an unbelievable experience. Standing in the one graveyard with so many graves, it was unbelievable. All you could see for miles was graves. It was an amazing feeling.
The serried ranks of graves are quite a thing to see. Like it's pretty shocking when you first see it. Just all the white tombstones, and that was just pretty shocking.
I would recommend it to any person to come and stand in any of the graveyards here in Belgium. Come and see the graveyards, stand in the middle of the graveyards and tell me, after they've been there, can they justify war? Can they justify violence? It changes you. I would recommend people to come and experience that change. It's like a spiritual change.
I've always tried to use World War I as a sort of a model of tolerance to show how the Nationalists and the Unionists fought and died together on the battlefields. And many of them actually tried to save each other when they were out there. And while you try to teach that in the classroom, pupils don't really get that in 40 minutes. If you take them to the real place and leave them there for 6 days, they can't avoid getting the message. And they do come back, change people.
World War I was part of our curriculum. We'd learnt about more of the statistics, you know, how many people died, and you had an idea, but you didn't learn the human side until you actually went over there. And we weren't really told about the brotherhood these men had, you know, between Nationalists and Unionists. We weren't aware of that.
It was just interesting to see that when it came to really difficult times during the war, 36 Ulsters and the 16 Irish came together and fought together, settled their differences and fought together for a common cause.
When you seen that they fought side by side, shoulder to shoulder, it really showed that they're the same, they're fighting for the same thing, freedom.
The mainly nationalist divisions were fighting along with Protestants, and it didn't matter. When you're out in a situation like that, it doesn't matter, like, you know, you helped your fellow man.
As Major Willie Redmond, leader of the 16th Irish Division and Nationalist MP, wrote, "It would be a fine memorial to the men who have died so splendidly if we could, over their graves, build a bridge between North and South." On the 7th of June 1917, Willie Redmond was killed. But a particularly special moment occurred that day, one that illustrates true humanity and shared brotherly respect.
It's not that long ago that someone told me that John Meek, the Ulster volunteer, was the man who pulled Willie Redmond, the Irish volunteer, off the battlefield and tended to his wounds.
Willie Redmond was from the 16th Irish Division, and he was wounded and he was left for dead, and John Meek came along and he helped.
Meek was a Protestant. He was in the 36th Ulster Division, and he helped Willie Redmond. It didn't matter about religion or nothing.
He stayed behind and he helped Willie Redmond rather than go on, which was, he was disobeying orders, and you can get shot for that then.
Under heavy fire and at much danger to himself, Meek carried Redmond back to an Ulster Division aid post, suffering several wounds himself in the process. Unfortunately, Meek's heroics were not enough to save the ageing Redmond.
And it was Willie Redmond's dying wish that the Ulster Volunteers offer a guard of honour at his funeral. You know, little things like that tell us the common horror that people went through and the degree of value that they placed upon each other. We've gone into our history, we've discovered a time in our history when the two sides actually fought and died side by side. And the message we're getting across to our people is, well, if we were able to do it in 1917, why can we not do it now? How was that lost to us? How was that piece of history all submerged in history and we never knew anything about it?
Just a day, another day.
We went to the grave of John Condon, and that moved everybody.
The Belgian sun.
And it's really quite a relatively small cemetery, but nobody could speak.
Until I see the name John Condon carved in stone with harp and crown.
You can't understand what it's like until you're out there and you're seeing, you know, graves like John Condon, a 14-year-old boy who lost his life, you know, and you just can't describe the feelings whenever you're standing at his grave. It's just so upsetting.
It's for a boy who died a soldier, wee lad who'll not grow old.
You know, it was just so upsetting being there, and it was just really emotional whenever you're standing there and you just see it's all summed up, like, you know, the worthlessness, everything, like there's nothing to be gained by war.
John Condon, his grave and the actual cemetery is one of the most visited areas in the Western Front. And he's a wee boy. It says in his gravestone he was 14. He was actually younger. He hadn't reached his 14th year yet. And he came from Waterford. The story goes that he didn't have a pair of shoes and he joined the army to get a pair of boots. We don't know.
This living hell, this polka pal, where young men fell like you, John Condon.
He took, we believe, our brother's birth certificate, lied obviously about his age, may have looked tall, joined up and ended up in one of the famous battles, and his remains were located, and that's the story of John Condon. And the kids see, well, it could be them. He was only 13 or 14, some of them were only 15 or 16. They see it could have been them at any stage, and they see the futility and the hopelessness of war, and maybe that's one of the areas that bonds them together as well.
Wee lad who'll not grow old, heroes that don't come home, here they lie in Belgian fields.
That's a boy who didn't get the chance of growing up like we have the opportunity to do now, and that was pretty sad. That was a really sad time for me.
It was awful. Ruth, the girl that went with us, she was singing. She actually sang the song John Condon. Me and her became so close, and me and her standing linking arms, and no, her come for me because I was crying at it was just moving.
So undeserved.
I've literally had tears in my eyes listening to young people tell me about the First World War and tell me about their experiences on that conveyor belt, because once they arrive in Belgium, they step onto a vehicle that is just wonderful, just incredible, and it shows, and it absolutely shows.
And Picardy.
The futility of war just was brought home to them, and the futility of fighting. And they realised we need to start building a future, we need to start building a life together rather than a life apart.
Gallant young men from all parts of Ireland gathered the poppy to brighten up a living hell in those First World War trenches of France and Flanders. That innocent little flower offers no offence to anyone, yet we, from the comfort of our firesides, have made that innocent little flower a symbol of division.
It's just a flower, it's innocent. It's the same as the men that died. You know, I viewed completely different to what I did previous.
Before, I would have wore a poppy, but I would never really have thought of why I wore a poppy. I would never really have known the true meaning to wear one.
Both Catholics and Protestants, they fought together in the same battlefields. They helped each other, they put aside their differences, They were there to battle evil, and they went out and risked their lives for us, to show us that we shouldn't let this get a hold of us.
Well, there was certainly a stigmatism involved with the poppy before we went. Like, it was seen as a symbol of Britishness, but it's absolutely the opposite. Like, we were fighting on the same side in the war. The Irish people were there, the English people were there, fighting side by side.
The poppy shouldn't be something of a religion, but it should be something of peace and something of all the lives that have been lost, and just a remembrance towards them, because at the end of the day there were Catholics who went out there and fought.
Going off to war was a heroic thing on behalf of the thousands of Irish people that did, and they should be commended for that, and their deaths should be remembered.
We wouldn't really celebrate no poppy day or anything. Nobody would have wore poppies in our school before, but whereas now I think I'd be proud if we wore one. We've all agreed that we'll be wearing one next November and try and get as many of our friends and all to wear one.
There is a memorial to the dead of World War I at the Menham Gate in a town called Ypres. Every night at 8 o'clock there is a remembrance service, and the last post is called with a minute's silence. This moment of remembrance has been taking place in Ypres every night at 8 since 1928.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. We will remember them.
Seeing this monument just full of names, of soldiers whose bodies were never found, there's something very moving about that and very upsetting about that as well. You know, we'd all been put through this emotional journey, and it was very emotional, and there were times when it was very upsetting.
They get very emotional. It is a very emotional experience. It'll make the hair stand up on the back of your neck, and the kids, it really broadens their perspective from then on.
Students now and young people now travel a little more than possibly we did at their age, and travel does broaden the mind, and that's why the trip to Belgium has been so good. They didn't go in their green uniforms, or they didn't go in their navy and grey uniforms. They went just as young people together on a project, and found out that they'd actually more in common than they had actually differences between them.